And as if this weren't enough to prove that Anti-Pope Paul VI did bind his subjects to the heresies of Vatican II, and therefore could never have been a true pope, we quote his closing brief at the council. Paul VI, brief declaring council closed December 8, 1965. We decide, moreover, that all that has been established synodally is to be religiously observed by all the faithful, for the glory of God and the dignity of the Church. We have approved and established these things, decreeing that the present letters are and remain stable and valid, and are to have legal effectiveness, and so that, as it be judged and described, all efforts contrary to these things by whoever, or whatever authority, knowingly or in ignorance, be invalid and worthless from now on. Given in Rome, under the seal of the Ring of the Fisherman, December 8th, the year 1965, the third year of our pontificate." End quote. There you have it. The apostate Second Vatican Council is to be religiously observed if you accept Anti-Pope Paul VI. But what about what Anti-Pope Paul VI said in his general audience on January 12, 1966, that Vatican II had, quote, "avoided proclaiming in an extraordinary manner dogmas affected by the mark of infallibility," end quote. This speech is quoted a lot by those who want to remain under Anti-Pope Paul VI, while not accepting the heresies of Vatican II. The answer is simply that Anti-Pope Paul VI's statement in 1966 is irrelevant. He had already closed the council in 1965. His statement in 1966 had no bearing on what he had already approved, decreed, and established by his so-called apostolic authority in 1965. But why then would he make such a statement? The answer is simple. Being fully under the power of the devil, Anti-Pope Paul VI knew that by making such a statement, he could convince his subjects, who had problems with Vatican II, to still accept him as a pope. They would still accept him as a pope, he hoped, despite the heresies of Vatican II, because they thought that it wasn't dogmatic. It was a brilliantly diabolical ploy. However, this ploy is blown to pieces when we reconsider the fact that the magisterium is irreformable. This means that if Anti-Pope Paul VI was a true pope, the decrees of Vatican II were infallible and irreformable from the close of the council December 8, 1965. Nothing said in January of 1966 could reform the decrees of Vatican II, or make them non-infallible, for it was already too late. By the way, in the same general audience of January 12, 1966, Anti-Pope Paul VI stated the following, quote, "The Council gave its teaching the authority of the Supreme Ordinary Magisterium," end quote. This part of the speech is almost never quoted by the defenders of Anti-Pope Paul VI, because they know that the teaching of the Supreme Ordinary Magisterium is infallible, which means that even this general audience of Anti-Pope Paul VI affirms the infallibility of Vatican II. Nevertheless, this 1966 speech is irrelevant to the actual authority of the Council, which was finalized in 1965. In fact, in his encyclical Ecclesiam Suam, Anti-Pope Paul VI said that Vatican II had the task of defining doctrine. Anti-Pope Paul VI, Ecclesiam Suam No. 30, August 6, 1964. It is precisely because the Second Vatican Council has the task of dealing once more with the doctrine de ecclesia, that is, of the Church, and of defining it, that it has been called the continuation and the complement of the First Vatican Council. Thus, there is no escape from the conclusion that Anti-Pope Paul VI was not validly elected, due to his being a heretic at the time of election. He never assumed the supreme authority in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church teaches that it is impossible for a heretic to be elected pope, since a heretic is not a member of the Catholic Church. This was defined by Pope Paul IV in the bull Cum ex Apostolatus Officio in 1559. Therefore, there is no compromise of papal infallibility in Anti-Pope Paul VI's confirmation of the heresies of Vatican II, since he was always an anti-pope. He never sat in the chair of Peter. It's quite obvious that Anti-Pope Paul VI was a direct communist infiltrator, as well as a Freemason who tried to usurp the chair of Peter with a plan to try to destroy the Catholic Church. In fact, here he is giving a Masonic handshake. This would explain why he was seen wearing the ephod, a Freemasonic vestment, which was also the vestment worn by Caiaphas, the Jewish high priest. Caiaphas wore the ephod when he ordered Jesus Christ to be put to death by crucifixion. Anti-Pope Paul VI was seen wearing this vestment in Yankee Stadium, as well as on 10 other occasions. Notice the 12 stones which represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Like Caiaphas, who ordered Christ to be put to death, Anti-Pope Paul VI hoped to put the Catholic Church to death, but he did not succeed. The Catholic Church still exists with that body of people who maintain the unchanging faith and refuse to accept his false Vatican II Church. Anti-Pope Paul VI's invalidity also explains why he sought the help of non-Catholic heretics in devising the new Mass, a false Mass which has caused the loss of faith in millions upon millions of Catholics. It explains why he single-handedly promulgated new rites to all 7 sacraments, changing the rites of ordination, confirmation, extreme unction, and the rest. It explains why Anti-Pope Paul VI in less than 20 years was able to do more damage to the Catholic world than any heretic in the entire history of the Catholic Church, including Martin Luther. No one ever caused the destruction that Anti-Pope Paul VI did with his apostate council, his abominable new Mass, and his sweeping and revolutionary changes. As one priest said, the very face of Paul VI reveals much. What it doesn't reveal, however, are the mysterious events that took place in the 1963 conclave from which Anti-Pope Paul VI emerged. There is much controversy about this conclave, as well as the conclave in 1958 from which Anti-Pope John XXIII emerged. Forgetting for a moment that neither of these two men could have been elected pope in a legitimate conclave, both being heretics, there is evidence that neither was even elected. Paul Scortesco was a cousin of 2 members of the Vatican's Noble Guard, including the president of the Noble Guard, which was responsible for guarding the conclaves of 1958 and 1963, and making sure that no communication occurred with the outside. Scortesco revealed the following in a published letter. Quote, "In the case of John XXIII, 1958, and of Paul VI, 1963, there were communications with the outside. It was thus known that there were several ballots in the first conclave, which resulted in the election of Cardinal Tedeschini, and in the second, Cardinal Siri." End quote. Scortesco obtained this shocking information from members of the Noble Guard, and Scortesco was found burned alive in his bed shortly after the publication of this letter. So Scortesco, prior to being knocked off, revealed that Cardinal Tedeschini, not Anti-Pope John XXIII, was actually elected first in 1958, and Cardinal Siri, not Anti-Pope Paul VI, was elected first in 1963. Scortesco also mentioned communication with the outside, which his later writings indicate involved the B'nai B'rith, Jewish Freemasonry. If communications with the outside unlawfully influence a papal election, this means that such an election is invalid. The outside communication with the Freemasons most probably prevented Tedeschini and Siri from having the free ability to accept their elections, probably by various threats, including death. The Communists and the Freemasons knew that neither Tedeschini nor Siri would go along with their evil attempts to destroy the Catholic Church, so they had to block their elections. If the outside communication mentioned by Scortesco did influence Tedeschini and Siri from having the free ability to accept their elections, then the subsequent elections of Anti-Popes John XXIII and Paul VI were absolutely invalid for that fact alone, for the Church teaches that each person in a papal election must be free. Those who want more proof that the elections of Anti-Pope John XXIII and Paul VI were invalid need only to examine the revolution they caused. One needs only to think of the desolation of the faith that ensued and the millions of souls that have been lost, and one needs only to consider how they wasted no time in systematically trying to dismantle